So I follow a lot of YouTube channels, and I came across a video on AP mastering where he's talking about clippers in a bad way. I do use clippers in like everyday productions, mostly for electronic music. But what I wanted to say is that I didn't agree with one of the statements he made. I do agree with most of the stuff on his channel, so I was surprised. Yeah, everybody can have a different opinion. It's all normal. We should be able to express anything we think, and then maybe argue upon it with different arguments. So what I'm trying to say is arguing that the clippers are bad, but based upon the example he made, which was really over clipped. And if you don't clip the signal at all, which is what he's shown us by using just the limiter, well, that doesn't suck. So anything on the scale of non-clipped to over clipped is going to be just another level of suckiness. Like, where do you want to be on the scale of suckiness? But you could say that about many, dynamic processes as well. You could over compress like crazy and say that sucks. If you don't compress, you see it looks good. So anything in between there is just going to be another level of suckiness. Well, it's not. It's compression. Sometimes it's really beneficial. Sometimes it makes things in your mix sound really cohesive and nice. And that's not the only use for a compressor being on the bus. Gluing your mix could be many different things used on a vocal. I'm not trying to name everything you can use a compressor on. What I'm trying to say is many processes can be viewed in that way. You can say the same thing about limiting, that if you over limit something, it's going to sound sucky. And then if you don't, it's not. So anything in that, in between is just another level of suckiness. And I have to say, we do use limiters and all those clippers because of, the imposed limitations of, digital audio and maybe also hardware components. We would be much happier maybe in this world without limiters if we didn't need them, if all the resolution was always endless to bit float, whatever. But the reality of the things is we're using limiters, and they became part of the sound. All the compression or the limiting became a part of the sound. So I don't agree with that final statement that, okay, even if I was to clip this less, it would still suck, but just a tiny bit less. As I said, you could do this with any kind of processing and say that, yeah, this is sucking, just sucking less. If you washed your song in tons of reverb, it would sound really sucky as well. So backing off on that reverb completely, so what is that? That level of suckiness? I don't think so. So I don't agree with the statement and the comparison that, if you overdo something, you can say that anything between it being overdone and not being done at all is just another level of suckiness. And I think it's not. We do use different kind of processes for different kinds of, problem solving or, mixing or enhancing the sound. So it could be anything, as it could be reverbs to add some depth to the mix. So we use those in moderation, everything being used in a specific manner with specific taste. And that is what, the entire profession is about, being able to recognize what the problem is and actually resolving that problem with many tools that can actually resolve it. There is usually more than one way to sort out a specific thing you hear is wrong in a song. So we use tools for that. And to say that, those tools are bad because if you overuse them, they sound bad. And if you don't use them, everything in between that is going to be just another level of suckiness. I don't think it's a good argument. I do use clippers in my, everyday work all the time. Specifically on electronic music. And I do know that if I was mastering, let's say an album, I mastered a lot of albums that were just a piano. You could hear that. Like if you use the clipper on a piano, it would sound stupid. You could hear the additional harmonics immediately. A piano is something that's really unforgiving because almost everybody knows what it's supposed to sound like. So adding compression, adding clipping is impossible. Adding limiting even to a piano is really, really hard. It's really noticeable. So controlling the piano's volume, to have some kind of mastering so that you can, put a cohesion on the entire album of, music just played on a piano is quite hard, which is something you would not think. Having like just one instrument has to be easier than having a whole, plethora of instruments playing in a single song. but it's not always like that. So using clippers for, of course, loudness gain, clients expect a certain result, and to meet their expectations is, something that Clipper really helps with. And I can say that for electronic music because it really does. And depending on the sort of music you're working on, depending on the song, even. I don't use clippers everywhere. Sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes a hard clipper doesn't work and a soft clipper does, and vice versa. I'm trying to say that, sometimes it really does, because limiters, they do have an attack and a release. That release really helpful with not producing distortion. That's why we use limiters and not clippers all the time. And the envelopes that control that release time are quite sophisticated to produce, less distortion and to be more transparent. But if you really press something hard, and if you also have some peaks shooting through that touch that threshold and push that limiter into reacting, those release times are going to reflect on the song and will cause sucking and pumping artifacts. That is why using a clipper to just cut off those short peaks, and I'm saying short because they have to be short. If you clip something that's longer, it will be more noticeable. So if you just clip that off, the limiter has an easier time doing its job without producing so much artifacts of pumping and sucking. The point was, depending on the source material, always, if you clip something that's really short, like a really short transient, it should be more transparent than clipping that with a limiter, because the limiter is going to affect what comes after that transient, and the clipping will not. Of course, it's less forgiving. Clipping is going to be really fast to produce some distortion that is actually audible. It always does produce distortion. That's unavoidable. Anything you do to a signal to change it is actually distortion. It's not as the original incoming signal, so it's being distorted in some way. And what we call distortion is something audible, of course, something you can hear as those additional artifacts. If you do it to something really short, it's not that noticeable. It's much more transparent than a limiter, because the limiter is going to engage some, release, some sucking, depending on how hard you're pushing. So yeah, sometimes I really actually opt to using a limiter or some things instead of a clipper. Depends on if it's a single channel. So choosing the right tool for the job is paramount. But just not to get too far away from the main subject, I think that comparison of, overdoing something really sucks, and if you don't overdo it, it doesn't suck. So everything in between has to be another level of suckiness. I don't agree with it, because you could do that with a compressor, as I said. You could do that with a limiter. You could do that with saturation as well. You could oversaturate and say, well, it sucks. Maybe you see, if you don't do it, it's good. So anything in between, on that scale is going to be just another level of suckiness. I really don't think that's true. I really think that's a bad example of how to present that argument. See you guys in the next video. Bye. So far, I have recorded over 80 hours of lessons to help you become a professional producer. And now, thanks to Levin.org, I can offer them to everyone completely free. Check out the free music production certificate at mixingacademy.com.